Ephesians 3:17 and 18 have stuck out to me for years because I was never quite certain what this was talking about, but I was pretty sure it wasn't what people were saying it was. So let me get into here. At this point, Paul is like explaining the work that Christ has done in God's plan through the ages, and he's in the midst of praying for the Ephesians and by extension for us. And he says in verse 17, like, that you would be able to understand with all the saints. So it's like he wants this for all of us to understand the breadth and width and the height and depth, and to know the love of Christ. And it's a lot of modern translations and most of the teaching I've ever heard on this passage smush those together and say, oh, this is the length and width and height and depth of the love of Christ. But you can go into some of the older or more literal translations like a King James or a New American Standard, or you can go full nerd and dig into the Greek in there, and you'll find that it's actually two separate things. He clearly says, the length, width, height, and depth, and the love of Christ. And so whatever these dimensions are, he's not describing the love of Christ with those. And so it's like, what is he describing then? And there's not a cut and dry thing anywhere. I've seen commentaries that are like, oh, well, he's describing the New Jerusalem, or this is an allegorical meaning of the cross and stuff. And I don't think that's it, because Paul earlier on said that he was not writing confusing stuff. He's speaking plainly. So I don't think he's giving us this mystical allegory. But what he has been talking about is God's plan that was accomplished through Christ, and this great mystery that was just revealed very recently to the apostles. And he plainly comes out and says, the mystery is that Gentiles are part of God's plan. That God's redemption, God's mercy, and his whole scheme, his idea for humanity extends to the Gentiles. It's not just the Jews. Because that was mind-blowing. Like, forever, it had been that the Jews were God's people. That the covenant was with Abraham and with his descendants, and you had to be one of them to be one of God's people. You had to be a Jew. And everybody else, all the Gentiles, were just, I don't know, firewood for hell. And that was it. But this great mystery is that, as he said earlier, Christ tore down the dividing wall between Jews and Gentiles, and he brought us all together in one thing. We're all collectively his body, and we're part of this building on the foundation of the apostles and stuff. And he's going so much in how this plan that reaches, so far reaches the Gentiles. And I think that's what he's talking about in 17, because he's talking about like size, scale, magnitude, the length and width, height and depth. What jumped out at me is that, for one, he lists 4 dimensions, which is strange. And it's like, is he talking fourth dimensionally? Are we in Back to the Future here? And he's saying that, like, yeah, this is enormous and it reaches to everything, but then also extends throughout time. It could be. I mean, that makes sense, I guess. But I feel like if that's what he was saying, he would have explained it more. And then what I noticed is that kind of they're always in the same order, no matter what translation you look at and stuff. But it's length and width, height and depth. And so length and width we get. That's like a footprint. That's how much space it takes up. But then height and depth, I can see that in terms of like architecture, because you can have a building that goes above ground and below ground. And so it's the idea of like how high it reaches and how low it reaches. And that makes a lot of sense if you're talking in terms of God's plan. And you can make that scale whatever you want it to be. Because this could be social status, and God's plan reaches from the highest to the lowest. It can be spiritual development, and no matter how far you go, you're still in this plan, and he still has plans and more for you. And no matter how far you have sunk, he still has plans for you. You're still included in his plan. And so it's just this going forever, and I really think that makes the most sense. This is what Paul wants us to understand, is the scope and the scale of God's redemption plan. He's just been saying, like, do you get it that even Gentiles are included? And I think he's going, not even just like the good Gentiles, but God is extending this redemption, this mercy and offer to everyone. No one is excluded. in any direction you want to go, on any scale you want to slice it, it reaches to everyone. And that is God's plan. And it's like, and you need to understand that and the love of Christ, because the love of Christ will transform you. But if you don't understand the scale of God's plan, it's going to limit how far you offer the love of Christ to the next person. God's plan reaches and is available and wants to include absolutely everyone. And that's the mind-blowing part that he wants us to get.